listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Joni.
So in this episode, we talked to Orna Ross. She is a novelist and poet and also the director of the Alliance of Independent Authors. And our focus on this episode was kind of going global and how you can sell more books around the world.
I really enjoyed the conversation with Orna. She has so much knowledge. She's been in the indie publishing game a very long time, and she had some great predictions about the future of indie publishing. She talked a lot about making publishing more inclusive, more accessible. She also gave some great advice on realistic expectations for authors who currently are exclusive but are thinking about going wide. That was really useful.
We covered a lot in this episode. So we're going to stop talking, and here's the interview. Thank you, Orna, for joining us on the podcast today.
Delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
And to start, for any listeners who don't know who you are, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm an author, a novelist and a poet, and I'm also director of the Alliance of Independent Authors. So I've been in media and publishing in some shape or form for a few decades now, a long time.
And can you tell us, so you started by self-publishing your own novels, is that right?
No, actually.
Okay.
No, I didn't. I came to self-publishing. I had published really quite widely before that, both with corporate publishers. I was with Penguin for my fiction and with small indie presses as well. I did some feminist non-fiction with a fabulous press that's no longer in existence in Dublin. So I've been through kind of every kind of publishing you can think of. And I would have to say that I enjoyed the indie experience more. Obviously, it's a great privilege to be published through Penguin, and it was a great experience in so many ways. And, you know, when my first novel was accepted, it was, I felt like the golden ticket. I won the lottery, the literary lottery. But I actually found being part of that big sort of corporate marketing and not having any input into how the book was positioned in the marketplace and all of that, we saw the books very differently. And so the commercial imperatives, I felt, really overlaid my creative imperatives, if you like. So we had creative differences, and I kind of got to the point of thinking, well, what next when self-publishing emerged in the marketplace? And I thought, this is probably not going to be for me because I'm not that technical. And also I could see the value that a publisher brings to the publishing process. So I decided I'd give it a go. I'll do a little poetry pamphlet. So that's where I started. Instantly, I loved it. I absolutely loved the process of being involved in the cover and working with other creative professionals, all of that. But also I could see, oh my word, this changes everything. Nothing is going to be the same. You know, once authors have these tools and the ability to do this in this way, publishing itself is going to change enormously. And I looked for an association to join, and there wasn't one. And I really strongly felt there should be one for indie authors because I could see that it was a very different experience, and that authorship was really going to transform from being a career into being a business. And that seemed to me to be revolutionary, and I wanted to be in the middle of it all because it just seemed so wonderful.
When you first thought this is going to transform the industry, what were you predicting at the time, and how much of that has come true?
Well, I would say it's only really beginning to come, to land now. But maybe because I have a business background, I grew up in a public house in Ireland, which is very cliched, but a fact nonetheless. And so my parents ran a business, and, the author as artist is a trope that we're very familiar with. And in the 20th century, we had the author as professional with a career, in the universities, maybe teaching as well, or with a CV, getting grants and things like that. Very much professionalization of what it meant to be a writer. In the Middle Ages, it was a craft. It was part of the medieval crafts and guilds. And I could see, once authors retain their rights, then the author is the person in business. Once you're not licensing your rights exclusively to another individual, Of course, you can license your rights selectively and still be in business. But if you license all your rights exclusively to one publishing house, then you've no control over your metadata, you've no control over how the book is positioned, and so on. Once you begin to take that control back, then you are in business. And I think there is resistance, and has been resistance in the author community to that concept. I think there were early adopters, but I think now we're beginning to see that land in the author community, and that's the thing that I think is really potentially very revolutionary, because what we had at first was people going from being exclusively involved in a contract with a publishing house to being perhaps exclusively self-published by one outlet, whereas authors are now realising, well, if I'm going to be in business, I'm at the centre of it, and I'm using a variety of services in a variety of ways. And indeed, outside of my own home territory, which is kind of the topic of our talk today, also becomes very relevant, because if you are publishing in the traditional way and all of your rights are kind of going across to one publisher, then the local rights are kind of the centre, and then everything else is what's called a subsidiary right. But if you're an indie author, then actually the whole world is yours. It doesn't really make any difference. If you can crack it in a different territory, it makes absolutely no difference to you digitally. Very little extra effort to actually sell your books all over the world. And so the fact that you could have this global audience meant that almost every book becomes viable. If it's a good enough book, it can find enough readers in the millions and millions of readers worldwide. So again, that was a complete shift.
Definitely. So you mentioned that we wanted to talk about going global this episode. And since you're in the UK, you mentioned that there's some specificities. I'm not going to be able to say this, Joni. You're going to have to take it.
Specificities?
There you go, of the UK market. I'm just wondering how that UK market differs from North American, because I feel like a lot of the focus can be on North America, and like most indie authors are North American.
The way I think of it is like it's a wave that's going out across the world. So it definitely started in North America, and therefore North America is dominant in the sphere in terms of what gets talked about and how it gets talked about. So there's no doubt about that. But what's happening now, I think, and this started probably only just about a year ago, is that we're really seeing the market understanding that it's fragmented. It's not a one whole market. And we can feel, because certain services are dominant or certain territories are dominant, and we're hearing more about that, we can be really quite misled as to what's happening. So, you will hear regularly, you will hear indie authors make pronouncements based on their own experience. And so you've got a lot of North American indies who, because there are more of them, and more of them are saying these things, but because they're true for them doesn't mean it's true for somebody else at all. And the most important thing I think that's happening at the moment is that the realization that a lot of authors are making, that I can really make this fit me. I make this up as I go along, and how I want to do it is the way I should do it. And just because other people are doing it that way doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to work for me. So it's harder work. When we started out, it was really in the US and in Canada, it was really as simple as do a good book and put it up there and you will find readers for it. Those days are now gone. Those markets are quite saturated. You have to be, and there are amazing books coming out every single day. We're in a highly competitive industry. People are really good at their job, and lots and lots of people are really, really excellent. So that's what's going on there. In other parts of the world, the UK kind of came next. So the UK is kind of interesting because it's poised between a very highly developed market in North America, and then there's the rest of the world. And of course the UK, because of its history as a colonizing nation and a commonwealth, is very clued into the rest of the world and thinks about the rest of the world in quite a different way to the majority of writers in North America. So in a way, I find that UK indies are responding much better to the very concept of going global and thinking about emerging markets in places like China and India, and where there are massive middle classes just hungry for content. So, at the Alliance, we're actually specifically now at the moment, looking at this whole way, how do you market your books in a global way, rather than just thinking about your own territory? Because for the indie author, there's really no such place as abroad. The whole world is your oyster, but in order for you to take advantage of that, you may well need to kind of change your mindset. So in that way, I think UK indies are well placed to take advantage of that. And then there are just differences. There are differences in the UK in terms of what works for covers. There are differences around themes. There's far less godliness, for example, than there is in North America. Certain kinds of violence don't play well here, and that do play well in the US. So I think every territory is like that. It's like, when you have to travel physically, it's the same thing when you're traveling emotionally and mentally in a book. You have to understand cultural differences if you're approaching readers in those countries. And then you get these crazy mysteries where books that you would never expect to fly in another culture just take off. I'm thinking of a Dublin writer I know who wrote a book that was extremely Dublin based with Dublin dialect practically. It's huge in Japan. Who knows why? I don't. No idea. Nobody can kind of work that out. So with books, there's always this kind of mystery thing that's going on, but I don't think we can account for that. We have to go with what's kind of makes sense.
I'm going to go a little bit off piece with my next question, but I would really like to hear your perspective on this. I think there's been, in the last little while, the traditional publishing industry has been a little bit under fire with regards to diversity in publishing, different voices to what the industry has been very set in its ways for a few years, shall we say. And I'm wondering, do you think that the indie market offers opportunities that might open up more for anyone to publish their books?
I definitely do. I think I've been listening to, as I said, I've been decades in the publishing and media industry. I've been listening to people paying lip service to this problem, in waves. So what kind of happens is that somebody wakes up to the fact that we are ridiculously non-diverse as an industry, and that so many voices are not heard. And then everybody feels bad about it, and everybody wishes it was different, and everybody tries to do something about it. And then it's a huge problem for an establishment industry to take hold of. And then it fades away because nobody really knows how to do anything about it. And then something awful happens again, like most recently the Floyd murder, and it rears back up again. For me, self-publishing is the answer to this question. It is the solution to this problem. However, just because anybody can, in theory, self-publish a book doesn't mean that anybody can actually self-publish a book. I do think this is something that we in the industry need to think about. And we have actually planned for next year, for late 2021, we're going to be launching a program called Self-Publishing for All, recognizing that if we do want to hear other voices, there's certain kinds of supports are needed. So, and if we, tying back to what we were talking about a little earlier in the conversation, if we recognize that author publishing is now a business, then what's needed is business skills, as well as publishing skills, as well as writing skills. And these are three big asks, to publish a book well, to sell it widely, requires a big upskill for everybody. And if you come from a place, if you just go back 100 years ago to Virginia Woolf's idea of a room of your own and the equivalent of 500 a year, that still for a lot of people is a privilege that they don't have, that the equivalent of that. And so are there ways in which we can, rather than the traditional grants, which were to buy time to write your book, that we would think about actually investing in skills? That the old idea of, give someone a fish and you feed them for a day, but teach them to fish, you feed them for life. We'll teach people how to publish well, what it means, give them those skills. And you're doing something, I think, that's much more doable than trying to change the world at the level that we can't. It's something very practical that we can do and should do.
That sounds great. And this program's Publishing for All, you said?
It's going to be Self-Publishing for All. Yeah. So we're now just talking to people about in different areas, and we'll work through people who are already doing work with marginalized communities and people whose voices we don't tend to hear. There's already a lot of good work going on, but it's not sinking in with publishing. But now I think self-publishing gives us the ideal tool to bring to people and to actually make a difference there.
That sounds like a really exciting project.
I'm excited about it.
That kind of leads us into the next question is like, what mindset does an author need? You kind of touched on it briefly, but could you expand a bit more?
Mindset. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So mindset's so important for an indie author in the first place. So getting the indie mindset in the first place is the first step. And, you know, an independent author is not just somebody who has put a book out, you know, published a book and put it out there. An independent author is somebody who actually values independence. And I'm back again to that idea of business. So they value production over perfection, for example. They value actually getting the book made up and out there more than they value validation from critics or industry folk who say yes or no, and so on. There's a whole sort of independent mindset that you can develop and bolster your own ability. I think the freedom that we have here is quite frightening for a lot of authors, actually, because there's a lot of responsibility that goes with it also. And I think we're only beginning to explore all the possibilities that are available and open to us for that very reason. These are it is that thing of needing to expand our mindset. Also, the idea that you really don't have a choice. You are in business, whether you like it or not. And so you may as well do it well. And the idea that business skills are just like writing skills and just like publishing skills, they are something that can be developed. So you need to develop that sort of what Carol Dweck calls the growth mindset rather than the fixed mindset. So it's something that you can, you value the act of learning, of exploring, of experimenting and finding out more as you go, learning by doing, essentially. So all of these things are essential in the first place, I think, for indie author success. This is where it starts. And then if you start thinking about going global, then you need to bring in that aspect of it. So that understanding that I said earlier, that there is no such place as abroad, really, where you have to think and at the same time being culturally respectful and sensitive. So it's holding those two things together. So not making assumptions, because it has always been like that in your country, that it is like that for everyone. Or even down to talking about things like summer sale when it's winter in the Southern Hemisphere, for example. That kind of awareness is important, I think, when you're talking to people, when you're setting a time for an author event, to put in global times so that people can get some sort of idea of where it is for them, or perhaps even to arrange two different events, the same event twice at a time that would be suitable for the other side of the world. These are just small things that I'm talking about, but just to give examples of the kinds of things that you do need to start thinking about when you think about going global. And developing what I call the outsider's eye, where you can, I think the more mainstream you are in terms of skin color, sex, gender, sexuality, territory, the more blind spots you have. It's the people who are on the margins see more clearly. And, it's developing, kind of getting beyond your own blind spots by talking to people who are not like you. If you want to publish in a specific country or place, really engaging. And social media allows us to do this now. We don't even have to leave our studies or our armchairs to do this, but really genuinely listening and engaging and growing and learning because that's what writing and publishing should be all about, that sort of communication and cultural exchange. I think it's all super exciting in terms of its potential.
I know in trad publishing, a lot of times there's a big difference between release date for books, especially UK versus North America, for example. Is that something that you would encourage indies to do as well, to stagger release dates?
I don't think so. Not for ebooks and audiobooks, certainly. Perhaps if you were planning a real assault on the print market, you might think about that. You might even think about different covers for different territories. But if you, and I stress, not if you're just going to sell your POD book online, as you're selling your ebook and your audiobook, but if you were actually genuinely trying to get into libraries and bookstores in a particular territory, it might make sense to give that book a completely different release date and build a lot of launch activity around it in that territory, and then do it a different time and a different date in another territory. And the reason for that being is it's almost impossible to launch print in two different territories simultaneously unless you are Penguin Random House and you have that sort of infrastructure in place. It's very time consuming. It can be very rewarding in all sorts of ways, but it's high risk stuff, and it takes a lot of time, energy, and so on. So in that case, you might think about it. There's also the debate about whether you should simultaneously release all three formats or whether you should stagger them. And I don't think anybody's come up with the definitive answer on that. Again, as so often in publishing, it depends. It seems to be the answer. Staggering the release across the three formats gives you 3 cracks at a launch, which, if you've got launch activity backed up behind those 3 formats, can make a lot of sense in terms of what you can do. But also there can be, there's a lot to be said that the reader being able to just get that book in the format that they want once it comes out. You can frustrate your reader if you're staggering launch dates, and if you're bringing things out at different times, they can actually get a bit annoyed and not come back. You can lose a sale because it wasn't available in the various formats that they wanted.
Are there any other considerations that an author needs to, I know there are a lot, but what should an author be considering before taking their books global or selling in different countries?
Yeah, so once you've kind of got the right mindset in place, and you're having those kinds of conversations, I think the main thing to say is, and I think this is true of indie publishing anyway, you need to really think about how you're going to reach those readers. So you need to do a lot of work on that. It isn't enough to just kind of put the book out there and make it available. So let's talk about making it available first of all. That's key. So you distribute as widely as possible through as many different, in as many formats as possible, and using, people like yourselves who can bring people into libraries and to different territories all over the world, use aggregators, use services, go directly to the big services, use aggregators for the small services. That's our general sort of recommendation there. And the distribution tools that are now available to authors are second to none. We are so lucky. I remember just 10 years ago, it was impossible to do what we can do now. But of course, distribution is just the base. It doesn't really do anything. That's when the work begins of how am I going to reach the readers. And globally, you need a plan. So you need an actual strategy. I can't go into all the different things that you can do, because actually the problem here, or the challenge here, is not that, we don't have enough options. It's that there are way too many options, and which is your option, which is the ideal thing for you, is what takes a little bit of research. So you need to be guided by your own personal writing mission, what it is you want to accomplish creatively, and also what is most lucrative commercially is usually a good guidance as well. And wherever those two meet, that together with your micro niche, your genre obviously, and your subgenre, but your micro niche of readers who really want and value what you do specifically, that's what you need to discover. And you need to find a way where you can bring your book to them, which is more sophisticated than saying, here's my book, please buy it. You have to actually come up with a plan and a strategy which is going to engage them, attract them, bring them across your line, and ultimately get them to get to know you as an author, get to know your books and buy it. So essentially it's all about planning, and planning specifically for that particular territory.
For someone coming out of Kindle Unlimited, do you think that strategy would have to be a little bit different since their book has been available for a time to a certain section of readers, or how do you think they would go about expanding globally?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that people coming out of Kindle Unlimited face is that it isn't instant. So there is a sort of an instant gratification with Kindle Unlimited that is very understandable. It's a relatively easy way to put your book out within that community of quite avid readers. So it's a completely different thing then to go wide and go global. And the problem that I see happening most often is that people expect it to be easier and quick and easy. So I would say to anybody coming out of KU, you're now going into publishing in a totally different sort of way, and there is a learning curve again. It's almost like starting over because there's a lot to learn. Obviously, you're well able to put a book together and put it up on the platform, and you know how to maybe advertise on Amazon or reach readers on Amazon. But going wide and going global requires you to learn a whole new bunch of things and a whole new way of doing things, and it takes a bit of time. But it is well worth it in terms of it's great to use KU, strategically for different books and in different parts of your writing business and so on. But to have all of your publishing eggs in that one basket is pretty risky, and there is not a lot of independence in that, because if that one platform changes something, then your entire business plan it falls apart. And so I don't think that the KU author has to do anything different, but again, it's back to mindset. It's because you've been publishing and perhaps succeeding and making lots of money perhaps on that platform, and then you decide, okay, I don't like this exclusivity business, I'm going to start going wide with some of my books. Then you have to realize that you're kind of starting again. And sometimes because the KU author is quite experienced, they feel they shouldn't have to do that in a way. So it's about going back to that beginner's mind and realizing, well, if I can succeed on one platform, I can succeed on another, but I must realize that other platform performs in quite a different way. And then if I want to do another one, that performs in a different way again. So it's learning by doing it. It always sounds more daunting talking about it. Actually, when you talk about any of this stuff, it's a wonder that any of us ever do it at all. It sounds so daunting. But in the doing, it all comes right.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, because I think that's something that I know Steph probably also runs into this a lot. We got a lot of authors that leave KU and panic because their sales do drop, and it does take a long time. So it's always reassuring to hear somebody affirm that, yes, it does take a long time and it will get better.
Yes, and it will. And I always liken it to any other business. I mean, there is nobody, authors start in this business with perhaps slightly unrealistic expectations. And that if you were setting up a restaurant business or a pub business, as I was talking about earlier, an insurance business, or anything you would like to name, you would expect to invest a lot of money up front, and you would expect it to take 2 years. And why should an author business be any different? And sure, we had that kind of crazy moment when this all started, when it was super easy and you could make money just as long as you weren't, hopeless. You were able to do well, but that was never going to be sustainable. That was always going to be a moment in time. A business takes about 2 years to have strong, sustainable, scalable footing. When you get there and you have those underpinnings in different places and on different platforms, you're very secure and you're very scalable. The rewards are huge for the amount of investment of time and money, actually. They are really big because they don't have a ceiling. And as more and more people are reading in the world, which they are, and as self-publishing grows in itself, this whole world is expanding for us. And so once you get those skills, and once you have them, nobody can take them away from you, and you're in a very good position. So stop rushing is what I find myself saying to most authors so much of the time. Don't hurry. Get yourself set up in such a way that you can take the amount of time you need to take, because you've got a big ambition here. It's a big ambition to write a good book. it's a big ambition to publish well, and it's a big ambition to earn your living as an indie author. They're not small things you want, and so they're going to take time to develop.
I haven't heard someone say 2 years, but as you explained, I'm like, yeah, 2 years makes total sense compared to like a 3-month, I put my book out and I took it back in kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think if you I'm not saying it will definitely take 2 years, but what I'm saying is 2 years of honest hard work and you'll be fine. And it could come a lot sooner than that. But short-term thinking is we're very impatient. I think indie authors in particular seem to have the impatience bug built in.
Yes.
Okay.
So we kind of skipped this question in the beginning, but I wanted to go back to it. Do you find it's hard to get your voice out as a UK indie author when North American authors kind of, not more popular, but maybe more vocal about what's worked well for them?
Dominant, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes and no. So it depends on what it is you're trying to express. So as if I'm speaking from the perspective as an author, reaching readers, what other people are doing is actually irrelevant. It's not the most important thing. Writing and publishing is a little bit different to other areas in that way, in that it isn't a zero-sum game, and there's a lot to be gained by collaborating and working with people who are doing well and are quite vocal about what they do, and you can learn from each other and grow together. So it doesn't really matter all that much if what we're talking about is as an author trying to reach readers. I make my plan, I do what I try to do. The fact that there are other authors doing what they do, it touches off what I do, but it doesn't determine it. It's not deterministic, and it's not dominant in the way it would be in another market segment where somebody can come in and literally just clear everybody else out. There will never be an author who will come in and get rid of everybody else, no matter how good the author is. In fact, writing like them or being allied to them in some way can often be a benefit for you rather than a problem. So it's a bit different in that way. However, in terms of getting messages about self-publishing or perhaps particular messages that we want to get out to the world, if there is a group of people who are from one particular mindset, it's back to that whole idea of the mainstream, isn't it? The mainstream speaks as if it is how things are, whereas we know that there is always a diversity of responses and they're all actually equally valid, but we're not necessarily hearing them all. So in that sense, I think it's good if the conversation can be more global in every sense of the word.
How do you think that COVID and not being able to congregate physically and have events and go to conferences and that kind of thing will impact the publishing industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the print-based physical book industry is in a scary place and a worrying place for us all, for anyone who cares about books. I think they're going to be very hard hit. There are a lot of businesses that are going to go out of business. They're just not going to be able to weather it. I think conversely, the digital book business is doing very well, and particularly in particular genres. So there are winners and losers in this, as there always are. I can see in our membership that when this started, anybody who was depending on physical sales, and we were amazed, very surprised to find out just how many of our members were very successfully selling physical, in physical locations, be it markets at the weekends or back of the room sales from speaking or, performances or whatever, but their business was very tied up in physical presence. And there were far more people doing very well at that than we had previously. We had always assumed the easiest and most lucrative way to be an indie was ebooks and audiobooks, and sell online. And that is true, I think, for the majority. But nonetheless, we were quite surprised to find out how many people actually had their income devastated overnight by this. And I think what COVID has done for the indie side of the industry, indie author side, is accelerate some trends that were already in motion. So, more people publishing digitally, more online events, more Zooms, more podcasts, more video, live video, all of that, more and more of it, and more authors being forced into it that wouldn't have otherwise, which is probably for them a good thing. But the other side of the industry and the lack of the ability to meet at conferences, I'm meeting people face to face and physical connection and physical bonding that happens at conference. Really, that's all conferences are about. There's no business done at any book fair or any conference that couldn't be done online. Really, it's just that's how it's always been, and that exchange that happens physically is just wonderful, and without it, it's not quite the same. And publishing feels a bit flat, because I think we're all very bookish, obviously, and we're introverts and we love our own time and our own space and our all of that. At the same time, I think we are people. Publishing is a communication business, and it doesn't feel the same not having them. I look forward to the day when that returns, but I think that publishing will never be exactly the same again afterwards.
What about impact on creativity in writing? Because at the beginning of the lockdown, I know for me it was very, very difficult to sit down and read, because I was worried all the time and I was looking at the news. And I think that in one way, authors right now have a lot more time than they might normally, or maybe their lifestyle hasn't changed at all, but people are going through a lot mentally and going through a lot of anxiety, and maybe have children at home that are making it difficult to write. Have you noticed any impact that you know of, or among the community?
Yes, definitely. I think the community is split, actually. It's one of those things where, you hear people saying, right, so either this, that, you want to say, no, they're not. There are all sorts of different things, and that never worked. But actually, in this case, I think people either took to it, and sort of buried themselves in, started writing twice as fast and doing twice as much, and really threw themselves into work, and the fact that they couldn't travel and couldn't go out was fine with them, and they were very healthy and delighted, to the complete opposite, where there's definitely a band of authors who still are not able to settle and feel. I think these tend to be more sensitive people who are more porous to social emotion and social experience, and they're really finding it very difficult. And of course, then, as you said, there's all the practical things. If you've got children and the children are at home and you're trying to homeschool them at the same time, as how on earth do you keep your concentration, your focus on your novel or your book? It must be extremely difficult. Likewise, if you've got vulnerable parents or other people who are dependent on you, and again, depending on the size of your room of your own, you may have been used to a room of your own when everybody cleared off and went to work, but now they're working from home, and while you're trying to do your writing, they're shouting to their office, at the next desk or whatever. So I think people are facing, big challenges, big physical challenges, and challenges of all kinds. So it's a funny old time.
So we tend to focus on tips and advice for new authors starting out, but I was wondering if you had any tips or advice for veteran authors.
Yeah, when I think about this question, I always think, the thing that a starting out author most needs to know is they need to get more stock together. So a beginner author is very caught in that first book. That first book is a huge thing in anybody's life, and a lot of authors get stuck there. They never get over it, actually. They're still there kind of 10 years later. So at the beginning with a beginner author, it's very much about getting more books out there. I would say, when you're more established and when you have a good stock of books, that you can kind of ease off on that part a bit and think more about how again, it's so fantastic that we can have this thing that used to be called the backlist, that now can be the front list if I decide it is tomorrow. So, that tendency to kind of keep on producing, it can work depending on the genre you're in. But I see authors who are doing it in genre where actually they would benefit more by going back into previous books and giving them some marketing love. That's one thing. And another thing I think is that the more established author who has good sales should think about trading in their rights in some way and getting some selective rights licensing going for themselves. Because what that means is that you can, any ways in which the veteran author can exploit the work they've already done and get used to putting that into their process, rather than treating every book as a new book and then as soon as that one's done, I've done my launch and it's now behind me and I'm on to the next one again. Yes, of course we want to keep writing, and we do, but not to forget that stock, and that it can be used in all sorts of different ways. So, you can make more money from your book by actually thinking about its terms, its possibilities in other formats, film, TV, and translation, particularly translation, so to engage with the whole oeuvre and the whole stock in that way, I think would be the advice.
That's really interesting. Would an author do that themselves, like approach a publisher in another country for like translations, right? Or how do they do that?
Yeah, so with translations, it's kind of breaking down into two. We did an indie author rights program last year. We took a few authors over 6 months, and it was supposed to culminate in London Book Fair. But with COVID, our great climax didn't happen. But we did go through the process of looking at licensing translation rights in particular, and there was a few offshoots from that. And it was very interesting. And the authors basically fell down into two types. So there were those who were pitching perhaps overseas sub-agents, or pitching directly into overseas publishers, and yes, succeeding in that way. But then there was another group that said, you know what, no, I don't like this pitching business and people saying no to me. I've succeeded in English by doing it this way. I'm now going to get my book translated into German, get some kind of connection in Germany who will help me to, if the translator can also be the marketer there, I'm much more comfortable with that route. So we have members now who are taking both routes and doing well in both. And we also increasingly see rights buyers are approaching indie authors and saying, I've seen you at the top of Kobo's best-selling list or whatever. Would you be interested in licensing your Albanian rights to us for 3 years or whatever? So our thing, our kind of advice around all of this is to always think about your book as like a house with lots of different rooms, and to only rent out the room that's actually going to be used. Don't rent the whole house to somebody unless they have a plan for it and they are willing to invest in some way. Then don't go there. But that one book could actually sell in lots of different ways, in lots of different places and formats and shapes and sizes.
I like thinking about books as a house. I really enjoy that. So we're on to our fun questions now. What have you been loving lately? It can be a book, movie, TV show, something that's helping you get along this summer.
Oh gosh, yeah, what have I been loving? I love too many things, that's my problem. So I have been really serious. My daughter is back living with us just briefly, and she is a documentary fiend. So I have never been really somebody who watches documentaries. But I have been loving how that whole world of docudrama has evolved, where they're like novels now. They're shaped in such a way that I can literally see the fiction to tricks and tools being used to shape documentaries. So I've been really enjoying watching documentaries with her. And I find now, and I think that this is happening with a lot of authors, that when I am taking a break from my own writing and stuff, that I am inclined at the moment more to watch screen rather than read. I'm not reading as much in this time. I don't know why. There's something about turning on the box when you couldn't get outside. That'll probably change now when we're allowed out of the house again.
Do you have any favorite documentary that you've seen recently?
I don't know if favorite is the right word for it, but
most interesting.
Yeah, we just finished actually watching the Harvey Weinstein one, just because of that arrest happened here in the last couple of days. So yeah, I wouldn't call it entertainment viewing, but I would call it required viewing for everybody. And again, I thought it was very well done.
What's the title of that one?
Oh, it'll come to me. Sorry, I don't
That's
know.
okay.
Find it.
We'll figure it out.
Didn't expect to be talking about it. Yeah, it's a 3-parter and it's on Netflix.
Okay, people can find that for sure. Jeffrey Epstein. Maybe.
That's a whole different.
That's another one.
Level, man.
Sorry, that's the one I meant. Oh dear.
Oh,
Edit. That's actually the one I meant because Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested here just a couple of days ago, and that made us watch it. It's the Epstein. Well, I keep mixing those two names up.
I can see why. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you corrected me though. Yeah. So I forget what it's called though. I can't remember.
I think it might just be called Epstein.
Yeah, I think his name's in the title.
It is extremely well done for such a sensitive topic, and as I said, see the whole construction of it to really bring the story home, and yeah, it's pretty important stuff.
You mentioned A Room of One's Own. Is there any other book that has been a big influence on your writing career?
Oh gosh, so many. I would say the biggest influence on me as a writer, though, is not books about writing. It's actual novels themselves. And I think this happens, in early life when you're just consuming novels. You don't even realize what you've taken in. What I did, I don't do it so much now, but what I did for a period of time in my life when I was kind of consciously training myself to become a better writer was I would read twice. I'd read the book as a reader first to just read it and enjoy it. And I would just mark things that made me laugh, made me cry or whatever as I went through. And then I would go back and actually analyze how that writer got those results and effects, how they actually made that happen and break it down really, really, really small. So Woolf is a huge inspiration for me, and she's just an amazing writer and such a skilled cross person. I mean, she's just absolutely brilliant at what she did. But also, she and Leonard ran their own publishing press, and reading about. I actually just finished a couple of weeks ago the book about their self-publishing adventures and them starting off and buying first a little hand press and then a bigger press and publishing their own books and their friends' books first of all, and then how it grew into a full-on publishing house which is still in existence today. That was a really great book as well, and now you're going to ask me the name of it and I'm not going to remember.
We'll find it. I want to read that. That sounds great.
It's really good. It's so interesting to see how much of their emotions were exactly the same, and the excitement that she felt in not having to go through the whole submission and rejection process, and to be able to just get on and do the work. And him too, he published so much and it was so prolific, and he attributed that to the fact that they published their own stuff and he knew he wasn't going to get a no somewhere along the line.
And then what can readers expect from you next?
Oh, yeah. So next I have two, what will I talk about? Yeah, I always have a poetry book coming and something else. So I've been writing a lot of nonfiction in the last while. So I'm actually just finishing up a book called Creative Self-Publishing, which is everything I know about the kinds of things we've been talking about today. So not the technicalities of how to upload your book or that kind of stuff, but more about how to, fulfill those three big ambitions and fit it into your life and live a creative life as an indie author. So that's coming in September. And I have a book of love poetry called Showerings, which is coming in August. And then I am republishing a book that, my first novel actually, which is two books, it's broken into two, and I'm working on a third part of it. I published it a long time ago. It was I think 2011 or something, I self-published it. But in Ireland at the moment, it's based at a time, it's 1920s. It moves backwards and forwards in time between the 1920s and the 1990s in Ireland. Its centenary is just being said, the events that are written about in the book, the Irish Civil War, the centenary is approaching. And I've just put together a centenary edition, which I'm going to kind of republish now. So that's After the Rising and Before the Fall.
You've been busy.
Excellent. Yes.
Always. Always.
Amazing. Well, thank you for talking to us. This was a really interesting interview, so I really appreciate you coming on.
It was great. It was lovely to talk to you guys. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're looking for Orna's books, we will have links to them on our blog, or if you're interested in learning how to grow your sales, visit kobowritinglife.com.
This episode was produced by Stephanie McGrath and Joni DiPlacido. Editing was done by Kelly Robotham. Music was provided by Tearjerker, and big thanks to Orna Ross for being a guest.
If you're ready to start your self-publishing journey today, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing!